Hello everyone and welcome. Make a cup of your favorite drink and get comfortable because this is a wonderful time for news stories from Yellow Cat. Send your own stories in the comments below and maybe they'll be in our new video.
What is your worst experience with bad neighbors? Part 2. Moved into a crappy apartment in a building that was occupied by basically the worst people in the area. Pretty rural small town, junkies, alcoholics, etc. I moved there because I don't have a driver's license and I needed to live close to my new job at a cafe, no buses in the area except school buses, and it was relatively cheap. Anyways, one night when I came home from work, I met two of my neighbors by the entrance to the building. These two were living wall to wall with me, and I had listened to their drugged up saturnalias more than once. They started following me up the stairs, not saying a single word, just following me. I rush inside and lock the door when they start hammering at it, yelling, hammering their hands at the door so hard I thought they would break it. I yelled back at them, "What the F do you want? Leave me alone." They stopped their hammering and the man just said with a fragile voice, "We were just wondering if we could borrow your pee for a drug test tomorrow." I not so politely declined, told them to F off and called the police. Didn't live there for much longer, I'll tell you that. Buckle up kids, this one is fun. When I was growing up, my rear neighbor Janet and my mom were both going through rough divorces at the same time. My mom mostly kept to herself at first. Janet did not take that approach. At first it seemed frustrating but reasonable. We had dogs in a fenced-in yard in the suburbs. One day the dogs were left outside and barked too long. Janet filed a noise complaint. Then she started filing noise complaints anytime she saw the dogs outside. Then my mom started keeping them inside more. Then Janet filed complaints when she could hear the dogs barking inside, or when she heard someone else's dogs, or really just whenever she felt like it, because this wasn't about the noise, it was about Janet feeling a sense of control over something during an out-of-control divorce. Eventually, the cops must have told Janet she had to stop calling them, so she started calling animal control instead. The cops had, we presume, told her that she was at risk of a criminal charge for abusing police services, but animal control had no such protections. They had to come out when someone filed a loose animal report. It got to the point where animal control knew what was happening and would come to our door to make small talk with my mom just to file their report. They told her that as long as the calls happened, they had to at least come out. Then my mom had a feather-brained idea. Whenever animal control showed up, my mom would buy a 2-pack of lawn flamingos to put them in our yard. She was a teacher, so she got up early. When she did, she'd take the flamingos and make them stare at Janet's front door. Then she'd get home earlier than Janet and move them around just like normal decor. Whenever Janet made a call, my mom bought more flamingos. And whenever Janet made a call, a bigger and bigger flock of lawn flamingos stared her down the day after she left for work, but would be casually mingling when she got home. I can only imagine what she must have thought. One would have to think she questioned her sanity, both because of the movement and the incremental growth. But by the time it got to 12 or so lawn flamingos giving her the 100-yard glare, she made the connection. Janet never called animal control again after that. Lived in a small apartment, and my neighbors always cranked up their music to 11. Like, loud. And until something like 7 a.m. Maybe later, but that's when I would leave for work. It was so loud that I couldn't hear my own TV over it. My neighbors and I would bang on the door, but they would never open the door. It was like trying to sleep at a festival. Then, at some point, I found out that they often left for a bar across the street but would just leave the music on. So I would pull the breaker for their apartment, but they would just come back at 5 a.m. and turn it back on. It was reported by heaps of people, but nothing was ever done. So, at some point, I would jam their lock when they went out so their keys wouldn't work anymore and they had to get the property manager in while the music was blasting inside. After a couple of times of that happening, they were evicted. Maybe I'm the bad neighbor in this story. There's a whole list with this one. We moved into an apartment complex, and the neighbors right next door on our landing made our experience there extremely uncomfortable, to put it lightly. 2 weeks after we moved in, 20 armed officers showed up and breached the neighbor's door. The cops said they couldn't locate the person they were after, and that's all the info we got on the incident. Through our shared wall, we heard a man shout, "If you don't stop doing that, I swear to God I'll punch you again. Do you want me to punch you again?" Followed by a child crying. We called CPS, and then we were afraid because we were the only ones that could have heard, so they know it was us who called. Very often, we'd see strangers at the neighbor's doorstep. When they knock on the neighbor's door, it was easy to hear from anywhere in our apartment, and sometimes we'd think maybe it was our door. Many times we'd hear a child next door answer and then shout something like, "Mom, so-and-so is ready." I'd like to believe she was just giving haircuts or something. Technically still against the lease agreement, but based on the types of people showing up at the door, it seems unlikely. We were exiting the apartment at the same time as the neighbors and lived on the second floor. Their 4-year-old fell all the way down the concrete stairs to the ground level. We were horrified and moved to help. The mother stepped in and ignored us, yelled at her crying and definitely hurt child, and then quickly got in their car and drove off. We moved after a year and never looked back. But I do think about those kids, and I feel sad knowing that so many children are in abusive situations raised by incompetent parents who were likely raised in the same terrible cycle. The woman in question was aloof and paranoid, and she'd imagined threats and affronts from almost everywhere. This was already concerning, but it crossed over into being obnoxious when she started imagining, or just trying to convince everyone else, that she was some sort of secret agent. She'd stage loud telephone calls with headquarters about the alarming behavior of the other tenants, like my tendency to get home after 9 in the evening, which was clearly scandalous, and frequently yell at the people who'd stand on the corner to smoke. On one occasion, I heard her shouting at someone over the placement of a flower pot in their window, which was obviously an indication that they were selling drugs. Now, when I've told the story in the past, people have suggested that the woman was probably schizophrenic. Personally though, I think she was just an easily excitable individual with too much free time, too little tolerance, and a borderline narcissistic desire to control everyone around her. Put simply, she came across as being less of a menace and more of a nuisance, albeit one who just went a little bit too far once. One afternoon, I found this taped to a wall in the stairwell. The atrocious grammar, poorly photoshopped seal, and distinct absence of any legitimate contact information made the notice about as realistic as a scene from NCIS. Furthermore, the reference to the past 2 years seemed to indicate me as her primary target since I was, as far as I knew, the only resident who had been there for less time than that. Still, since the flyer was clearly meant to scare someone, I decided to return the favor by taking a page out of my neighbor's own playbook and standing outside of her apartment while staging my own fake phone call. You should see the notice, it's terrible! Yeah, it's like they don't even know that impersonating a federal official is a felony. Anyway, the real FBI are on their way and they're going to dust for fingerprints. I went back inside my apartment after that, and within seconds, I heard my neighbor's door open. There was the sound of hurried footsteps rushing towards the stairwell, followed by an equally hurried retreat. When I went out to check 5 minutes later, the notice was gone. Again, I viewed that as evidence that the woman wasn't actually schizophrenic because after the above described events, I never had any trouble with her again. Maybe she just decided that I wasn't worth the trouble. Alright everyone, sit down and buckle in because I've got a 15-year-long feud for you. My mom, dad, and I moved into a condo when I was about 14. It's set up like an apartment building, so we had a neighbor on our right and one below us. When we first moved in, we met Trina, our downstairs neighbor. She was an older woman, 60s, taking care of her mentally challenged grandson, my same age, but mentally a 6-year-old with minimal language development. She seemed sweet and welcomed us. We had a few small issues, but kept them to ourselves. She smoked a lot, like 3-4 packs a day, and the smell would overtake our house, and her grandson would scream a lot in the early morning, but nothing serious, and we never said a word. We were all friendly enough, and life was fine. About 2 years after moving in, my mom bought a portable hose to water her outdoor plants and clean the balcony off. This was when S hit the fan. Trina lost it when my mom washed the patio for the first time. Just water, no chemicals, just rinsing the dirt off. Trina promptly started screaming about killing my mom for doing this. She then complained to the condo association every single day for years. She started to burn small fires in a coffee can under our window in an attempt to smoke us out. She once saw my bedroom window was left open and literally flooded my room with her hose. She would call the police on every single noise we ever made, and it got to the point that if she called the police and they showed up and there wasn't an issue, she would be fined $50. A couple years later, I became pregnant young, 18, and my boyfriend moved in and we had a baby. She told my boyfriend that I had a revolving line of men and I was unsure who the father was, but chose him because he was nice. Completely fabricated. She continued with her nonsense for years and years. She once was driving down the driveway while I was getting my then 2 kids into the car. She literally tried to hit my oldest son with her car. I had to physically pick him up and throw him out of the way. When the police came, she denied everything. She harassed my family for years to the point of the condo association having to have private meetings with her and my dad, which nothing ever came of. The condo association was just as fed up as we were. 3 years ago, my mom died suddenly of CJD, and when she realized my mom was no longer around, she laughed and told my dad and my kids that my mom deserved to die. She was an awful, awful woman. She recently fell ill with COVID and subsequently had a stroke. We don't know if she is still alive or in a home, but my dad, who still lives there, says it's nice to be free of the constant harassment. Current neighbor. She has a small business practice out of her home. She had her customers park on my yard, easement technically, despite the town telling her she couldn't. Despite all the times I told her to stop, she never did until one person parked facing my house 2 feet from my no trespassing signs. Cops got called. I filed a complaint against the customer. Never saw that car again, by the way. Then she tried to lease my front yard. She tried to buy my house while we lived in it. She told contractors that they could access her yard through ours. They dumped a load of gravel and sand in my front yard as their storage area, and a cement truck tore 18-inch ruts in my yard. A tree on the property line was infested with termites and a huge branch fell on a mutually owned fence. She demanded we pay to have the limb removed because it was damaging the horribly dilapidated fence, but she didn't want us to cut down the tree because of the shade it provided to her back patio that was installed at the expense of my yard.
The whole tree came down.
If you want to watch the part 1, click the link here. Thank you for watching.
Thank you for subscribing, the likes, and the comments. See you in the next video.